Okay, fantastic. Thank you all so very much for coming out today. And of course, thank you so much to those of you on Zoom as well. It is truly a great honor to present for all of you. A lot of you might remember that I've been wanting to present for DVOC for many years, but I never felt that I really had a topic that was worthy of this fantastic club. But finally I do. So I am very, very excited to share this topic with you, which has really interested me for several years. All right, so let's get started because I am excited. So, okay, it's screen sharing, yeah. So, if one looks at Aztec society, you don't really have to look very far to notice that birds figure very prominently. So you can see here just one of many examples of truly beautiful feather work. It was a very widespread art throughout the Aztec Empire. Birds also feature very prominently in Aztec religion. Here you see a depiction of the god Huitzilopochtli, which literally translates to hummingbird from the left, and he was one of the main gods. And of course, you can see how his robes mimic the look of a hummingbird. So very much present there as well. Of course, the sign for the Aztecs for where to build their capital city, legend tells, is an eagle on a prickly pear cactus. And that has such prominence that it is used today on both the flag of Mexico and also the country's coat of arms. And in fact, the name Aztec actually comes from people of Aztlan. Aztlan literally means place of the heron. So you can see birds are very, very prominent in all parts of Aztec culture. However, it is my goal with this talk to show you that birds were not only deeply important, but also deeply studied and deeply understood. But before we dive in with the real ornithology, a little bit of background to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I will be focusing on, and most of my resources come from Tenochtitlan, which was the capital city of the Aztec Empire. And now when I say Aztec, I would like to stress that Aztec is not an ethnicity. Aztec rather refers to a political alliance. So a modern day analogy might be the state of Pennsylvania, let's say. You know, Pennsylvanians are linked under common law, common geographic area, but within that sort of overarching political unification, there are many different languages and cultures. The Aztec society was very similar. There were a lot of different subgroups and languages and cultures all incorporated in that society. Tenochtitlan is in the same location as modern day Mexico City, to give you a sense of where in the world we are. Mexico City was in fact built directly on top of Tenochtitlan. So while Mexico is sadly not part of the ABA area, it is of course still geographically North America. So you'll probably notice that there are a lot of familiar species that I'll be mentioning in the talk. Many of them are breeders here and fly down to Mexico for the winter. I'd also like to point out in this beautiful 3D reconstruction of the city of Tenochtitlan, you can see all of these really geometric grid-like patterns, and that is no accident. Tenochtitlan was actually a planned city. And this was something that was completely foreign to Europeans. And when the Spaniards arrived, they were just truly, truly at awe at the very neat and logical layout of the city, because again, they had never seen planned cities before, which I think is pretty cool. And as you can see over here, this roughly shows the area that was controlled by the Aztec Empire. So you can see how it's kind of south central Mexico. All of the sources that I have are, for better or for worse, strictly after European contact. And This is no coincidence. As you may know, much of the pre-contact writings were intentionally and systematically destroyed by the Spanish and by the church because they were deemed heretical. So very, very little survives from pre-colonial times. So again, all of the sources that I'll be using are after the Spanish reached Mexico. And they reached Mexico in 1519. So my sources and kind of the time period that we're going to be focusing on is roughly the entire span of the 1500s. So Tenochtitlán, as you may have seen in the prior image, was actually built on an island in the middle of a lake. And now I mentioned that it's the same location as modern day Mexico City, and we probably don't associate Mexico City with a lot of water. But these lakes were in fact actually filled in when the Spaniards were constructing their city in that area. But in the time period that we are looking at, it was still all natural lake. Um, and you can see that it's actually part brackish water and part fresh water, which I find really, really interesting. Not a lot of habitats that have sort of both of those kinds of water right next to each other, especially in an inland environment. Um, and as this map shows, there were also marshes along the edges, so not just open ocean, but also some nice wetland habitat for, like your rails and herons and things like that. So you will notice that as I'm going through various species accounts, water birds like ducks will actually figure fairly prominently. And again, that might not be the group of birds that we're particularly used to when we think of sort of central southern Mexico, but that's because the habitat has changed drastically in the past 500 years. So my talk will consist of three main parts. First, I will be going through various species accounts compiled by Aztec naturalists. I will then be going through accounts of bird anatomy. And finally, I will be closing out with a description of bird husbandry and aviaries. So for the first two topics, I'll be drawing almost exclusively from this work, the Florentine Codex. So I'd like to take a minute to familiarize all of you with it. So its formal name is General History of the Things of New Spain. Now that's quite a mouthful, so I'll just be saying Florentine Codex or maybe just the Codex. And it got that sort of nickname because a copy of it is held in Florence, Italy, and has been there for several years, or several hundred years rather. So the Florentine Codex is almost universally considered to be the most authoritative account of Aztec society. And it was created by indigenous scholars who were studying at a Spanish missionary school. They were led by the Spanish monk Bernardino de Sahagún. But again, a lot of this work was actually done by the indigenous students themselves. It's also widely considered to be the world's first ethnography and was created in a very similar way to ethnographies today. So these indigenous scholars went into the community, the indigenous community, and they interviewed individuals, and particularly those individuals who were considered to have the most knowledge. So elders, people in leadership positions, those sorts of folks. And all of this took place in the indigenous Nahuatl language. And the scholars would write down everything that was said to them as a result of this sort of questionnaire. And so you'll notice, in particular with the species accounts, a lot of it seems very methodical, and that's no accident. That's actually a feature of this sort of very systematic interviewing as a source of getting information. So the Florentine Codex was a huge work. It took most of a century to complete, actually. And there are 12 volumes of it. I will be focusing only on the 11th one, which focuses on the natural world. So plants, animals, landforms, things like that. Obviously, the most relevant to my talk. And the second chapter in there is the one that focuses on birds. And that chapter covers roughly about 130 different species of birds. And of course, remember that all of this was being done in a time before any sort of modern optics. So these birds, we were only given the Nahuatl name for them, or if we were really lucky, a few of them had the Spanish name. Definitely no English names though. However, as you are about to see when I start sharing the species accounts, they are described in such detail that it's actually very easy to identify most of them, which is pretty neat. All right, so let's get to these species accounts that I've talked about for so long. So first up, we have the blue-winged teal, or the Metzkanautli. Metzkanautli literally means moon duck, Mescli meaning moon, and Kanautli meaning duck, sort of a general term for duck. And I think, if you've ever seen a blue-winged teal before, or if you're seeing it on the screen right now, it's pretty clear why. And in fact, the species account starts by saying, on its face, it is decorated with white feathers like the crescent moon. And then we get a truly impeccable description of its wing pattern. The upper wing coverts are pale blue, those lying in second place white, those lying in third place green, resembling quetzal feathers, which is a reference to the fact that they're iridescent. The tips of its wings are black, its axilla white, its legs yellow, small, and wide. It does not rear its young here, it also migrates. So fairly short, but truly a fantastic account of this species. Very nice physical description of its migratory behavior. So definitely very little ambiguity as to the species. You will notice that it describes only the male. And as we know, most female ducks look very, very similar. And it's thought that overall they were considered to be of the same kind, sort of all female ducks, because again, this was before modern optics. They're seeing them at distance. They're just kind of, these mottled brown ducks. And particularly if you're not seeing them breeding in the area, there's no real way to know that they're the same species. Next up, we have another duck, the northern shoveler, or the Yacapatlawak, which literally translates to wide nose, which I think is just pretty amazing that across time and space, people have looked at this bird and just said, wow, that thing has a giant beak. Some things never change. So the account for this one also begins with an explanation of its name. It is named Yacapatlawak because its bill is somewhat long and very wide at the end. When it comes here, its feathers are still completely ashen. This is a reference, of course, to its drab eclipse plumage. But when it lives here, it molts twice. First, it sheds its downy feathers, and the second time when it is about to leave. And I thought that description of the molting cycle was really interesting. Other passages do have references to birds changing plumage, but molting isn't really explicitly mentioned in most of them. So I thought that was pretty neat. And then we get another fantastic physical description allowing us to identify the species. Its head is a very resplendent black as far as its shoulders, a reference to the fact that the head is iridescent and can look dark in a lot of light. Its eyes are yellow, its breast whitish, its back ashen. Its flight feathers green, glistening, black at the ends. Its wingtips are ashen, its belly shows tawny. Its legs are chilly red. Also, it does not rear its young here. It also migrates. So again, there's very clear understanding of migration, which of course stands somewhat in contrast to the European ideas that stayed around for many, many centuries that birds would hibernate underground or in the bottom of lakes. So sort of an interesting contrast in the way the natural world was viewed. And I also think it's really cool that there's this emphasis on whether or not birds are breeding in the area, because that's pretty similar to how we view birds today. We're doing the Breeding Bird Atlas in Pennsylvania right now. And why are we doing that? Because breeders are often considered to be like the true birds of the region, like where birds are breeding is sort of the benchmark for whether a bird truly belongs to a region or not. So I thought that was a pretty neat parallel. As for the Franklin's gull, or pipishkan, which literally translates to the verb for drizzling or snowing, its account is fairly brief, but still allows identification. It is white, like a dove. Its head is adorned black and white. It is a sea dweller and ocean dweller. It is called pipishkan because when it is about to freeze, when the maize is about to be harvested, it comes here. So again, very simple physical description, simple description of its migratory habits, enough to identify the species. But what I think is really cool is that you can see that the name Pipistrán has actually been immortalized in our current day scientific name for the species, which is of course Lucifeus pipistrán. I kind of stumbled across that by accident. I was looking in a field guide and I was like, wait, pipistrán looks awfully similar. And yeah, I did some research and that's where it comes from. It's pretty cool. All right, now a fun sort of more tropical bird for a bit of a change of pace. We have the aplomado falcon. And its indigenous name was Ecatotli, which literally translates to a Hecate falcon. Now, a Hecate was the Aztec god of wind. However, this name is not a reference to the falcon's flight or anything like that, as you might think. That's also what I thought at first. Rather, it's actually a physical description of the bird. As you can see in this depiction over here of the god Hecate, he has this white stripe descending from behind his eye, which the aplomado, of course, also has. And this pattern of naming birds for the god Hecate because of a stripe behind their eye actually comes up again and again. It's seen in a duck and also in a couple of species of hummingbirds. And of course, once we understand exactly what the reference is, to that god and how it plays out in physical description, it allows us to identify the birds a lot more easily. So the account for this is also fairly simple. It is the same as the falcon. It is named Ecatotli because its face is shot across with white, as I was just mentioning. Its feathers are somewhat dark. It hunts in the same way as the peregrine falcon. This is one of my favorites, although it's hard to choose. The common raven, or cacalote, named for its call, that caw. The account reads, also it is called kali and kakali, also references to the sound. It is really black, really charcoal colored, a well-textured black. Its feathers glisten. It is an eater of ripe maize ears, of tunas, which are the fruit of the prickly pear cactus, of mice, of flesh. It stores things. It stores ripe maize ears. It piles the maize ears up within the hollows of trees. So here we have, not only a physical description and a description of its diet, but also the caching behavior, which I thought was pretty cool. So this image that you see here is taken directly from the Florentine Codex. All of the illustrations were done by the indigenous scholars. You can see how the crow is holding a little maize ear right here, which is really, really cute. Also, you'll see that it has a gold border. All photos that you see here with that gold border were taken from the Florentine Codex. So that's sort of the system I settled on to denote images that were taken from there. And then now these adorable little things. The cliff swallows, or aquiquialot. Very brief description, but one that is very dear to my heart. It nests in the crags and house roofs, house fronts. It builds itself a nest of mud. It plasters its nest with its bill. So again, very simple, but leaves virtually no doubt as to the species. And over here we have another codex depiction. My understanding is that it shows the bird gathering mud, flying with the mud, and then using that mud to build its little nest on the house front. And I thought it was just pretty amazing that, 500 years ago, cliff swallows were doing cliff swallow things and nesting on buildings. And as long as they're house fronts, it seems like they'll continue to do so. So next up, we have what is probably the most interesting story in perhaps the entire Florentine Codex. And that is found in the species account of the great-tailed grackle, or Tenochtitlán. The account begins, like many others, with a straightforward account of the species' physical appearance. It has a long, nail-like bill. It has a good voice. I know you might not agree, but we can at least agree that it's a talkative bird. The one which is not very black, but a little sooty, is the hen. The very black one, very curved of bill, glistening, is the cockerel, and is called Tenochtitlán, which roughly translates to divine grackle. But now here's where the account gets very interesting.
Yeah, that one's good.
It is named Tenochtitlán because it did not live here in Mexico in times of old. Now, Mexico here is referring to the area surrounding Tenochtitlan, again, modern day Mexico City, not referring to the modern country of Mexico as we know it. So it did not live here in Mexico in times of old. Later, in the time of the ruler Ahuitzotl, it appeared here in Mexico, for he commanded that they be brought here from the provinces of Tenochtitlan and Totonacapan, which correspond to modern-day coastal Veracruz. And pay attention to that, coastal Veracruz, because on the next slide, we're going to discuss the significance of that a little bit more. It was made known especially that those which came here were to be fed. But when they multiplied, they scattered, they traveled everywhere, they ate everywhere. So here we have this account of a bird that was intentionally introduced because the emperor liked it. He thought their feathers were shiny, and they are. And initially they were protected, given supplemental feeding, but then we get basically a textbook description of an invasive species, right? They multiplied, they scattered, they traveled everywhere, they ate everywhere. So yeah, definitely I'd like to say that a lesson was learned there, perhaps, in the consequences of bringing a bird to a new area, but who knows? But now, if that account does not convince you, Dr. Hamig has also done extensive research into the current day ecological evidence that is still out there that proves this transportation and introduction of the great-tailed grackle. So his findings include that the great-tailed grackle, as you may know, much like the boat-tailed grackle, very closely related species, is strictly coastal in South America, as you can see on this eBird map here. But we can see something of anomaly because in central Mexico and the central United States, it is found in high dry environments, so very different from its typical low-lying coastal areas. Furthermore, the Mexicanus subspecies of the great-tailed grackle is found in both coastal Veracruz, again, where we said that those birds have been brought from, and the central Mexican highlands, which is of course consistent with the account from the Florentine Codex. For reference, coastal Veracruz is roughly around here. So naturally, this begs the question of what other birds have had their ranges altered by indigenous groups. So in his work, Dr. Hamig posits a couple of interesting species, and this is just an example of two of them, the military macaw and the green jay. Both of these have these very disjointed ranges, which of course, when you consider that they're non-migratory tropical species, it's very unusual to have this sort of range distribution. Of course, there are other explanations, such as displacement by a storm, but I think it remains a very, very fascinating and intriguing possibility, and definitely a field that is worthy of further research. Okay, so moving on to anatomy, and again, these accounts are still coming from the Florentine Codex. So we get a nice elaborate description of the various names for various types of feathers. Those which appear on their heads are called zinitzcan. Those which appear on the neck are called chapacayot. Those on its belly and its back are called alapachtle. Those which are right on its skin are called tlaxcayot, and this is referring, of course, to the down feathers that are, right on a bird's skin. And those which cover the base of the tail, or the upper tail coverts, are called olinkayot, poyawali, poyawalo. So you can see here how there are names for many different feathers from different parts of the body, much like the way we have names for the feather tracks. But you will notice that they don't really correspond to feather tracks as we think of them in current day science. And my understanding is that that is in large part due to the fact that, again, many of these feathers were used in art. And when you're doing art with feather, it matters a lot more the color and shape of it than exactly whether it came from, this side of the body or this side of the body. And to take like a very obvious example, like a resplendent quetzal is definitely going to have very different feathers on its head, which are going to be very small and shiny green, from the feathers on its belly, which are going to be a bright red, from the feathers on its back, which are also green, but a lot wider. So there's this naming system to really distinguish the different feather types that are being worked with. We also have a recounting of wing feather types, and you'll notice that this does correspond a lot more to our understanding of feather tracks as we would think of them today. The feathers on the wing band are called zinitskan. Those which follow are called zikoliukwi. Those which follow next, which cover the flight feathers, are called tekpatik. They are pointed feathers. And as you can see, this corresponds to the 3 layers of covert that birds have, and this is at the first joint of the wing. The flight feathers, mamastli, are long, hollow, shaft-like, a reference to the shafts of the feathers. Primaries, or ahavitsitli, these appear at the very tip of its wing. It is the real place of its flight. And now these accounts are interesting and definitely highlight the level of detail to which these birds were understood, but they're also very, very useful in helping us translate the species accounts, again, from that native Nahuatl language, and then allowing us to then identify the species from those translations, because we don't just hear like, oh, you know, like the bird had blue on its wings, but like, for example, with the blue-winged teal, we were told the first row of feathers at its wing band is blue, so we get a lot of detail. We also were given some accounts of internal anatomy. So there is the uropygial gland, which is, of course, that gland at the base of the bird's tail, from which it gets the oil that it uses to preen itself. So the indigenous name for that is chet. It is on its rump. It is odorous, smelly. So a pretty short description, but I think anyone who's been near a uropygial gland will be able to tell you that that is in fact accurate. For the crop, or tsatalili, we have the depository, the food bag, the refuse jar, the refuse net. And the crop is that first enlargement of the bird's esophagus, which is where the food goes directly after being consumed. The gizzard is the next stop for that food, or memetlat. The gizzard grinds, it pulverizes. And as I'm sure you know, birds obviously don't have teeth, and so the gizzard then takes on the work of grinding up their food. We're also given a description for the nictitating membrane, or ishpimpali. With it, it opens, it covers the eye, it blinks. With the eye covering, it sees in the water. And that last bit about seeing in the water is what allows us to tell that it is in fact the nictitating membrane, which is that transparent third eyelid that birds use when they want to be able to see, but still have some protection for their eyes. And here you can see a depiction of the digestive tract of a bird, which was again taken from the illustration in the Florentine Codex compared to a modern day illustration of the digestive tract of a turkey. We're also, and this might be perhaps the most magical thing in the Codex, we're also given a description of the formation internally of eggs, specifically of turkey eggs. A drop forms, it thickens, a covering forms, a shell forms, the egg is laid. And again, this is specifically of turkey eggs, and turkeys were fully domesticated by the indigenous people of Mesoamerica. So it stands to reason that this would be a species that they had very, very intimate understanding of, because many of them were, you know, since they're domesticated, living with people, and they would interact with them day in, day out. And perhaps one of my favorite parts of this presentation, and probably also my favorite illustration in the Florentine Codex, we are given an image that shows a depiction of catching birds in a net. And upon very simple inspection, we can see that it is very similar in really all important ways to mist nets that are used current day to catch birds for ornithological research. So we can see that it's supported by poles, has mesh pockets that hang down from trammel lines. Over here, we have an image of a modern day mist net. The angle's a little different, but you get the idea. Supported by poles, these mesh pockets that hang down from trammel lines. So really the exact same idea, which allows us to say it's been 500 years and we're still mist netting. Now I should point out that mist nets that are currently used for ornithology did not come from indigenous Mexican technology. Rather, they came from Japanese techniques to catch birds, but it was virtually the same thing. So it's just kind of cool to see this parallel evolution across the world, in which various people just figured out what works to catch birds. And as you'll know, if you've ever been at a station where birds are being captured or even just heard about this is a way to catch birds alive without harming them. Now, why might they want to do that? Because they had aviaries, and birds were very frequently kept as pets as well, in common people's homes. But as is, still the case today, the most extravagant examples were in those with the most wealth. So Emperor Moctezuma himself kept a very extensive zoo and aviary, or totocali, which literally translates to house of birds. And here we are just given an account of this aviary from the memoirs of a Spanish conquistador. And he wrote this, I think, like 40 years after having experienced it. So, it is a little later. Perhaps a couple of things had been forgotten, but on the whole, it's a very insightful account. So it begins with describing the great diversity of birds. There was everything from the royal eagle and other smaller eagles down to tiny birds of many colored plumage. Also the birds whose rich plumage they use in their green feather work. These are resplendent quetzals. There are other birds which have feathers of 5 colors. Then there were parrots of many different colors, not to mention the beautifully marked ducks and other larger ones like them. He continues, from all these birds they plucked the feather when the time was right to do so, and the feathers grew again. All the birds that I have spoken about breed in these houses, and in the setting season, certain Indian men and women who look after the birds place the eggs under them and clean the nests and feed them. So here we can see the great level of attention that was given to ensuring that these birds got a good quality of care. We also can see that they bred in captivity, which you may know is something that is often a little bit difficult. There are many species that just really don't want to breed in captivity. And we can also see that this breeding was not just something that the birds kind of started doing on their own, but it was closely monitored and regulated. And there was a lot of care placed in ensuring that this process went as smoothly as possible for the birds themselves. So when Hernan Cortez himself was visiting, he was so impressed at seeing this aviary that it actually made it into a letter that he wrote to the King of Spain. And he was writing from Mexico. So in regards to the water birds in this aviary, he wrote, for the seabirds too, there were pools of salt water, and for those of the rivers and lakes, there was fresh water, which for the sake of cleanliness, they renewed by means of pipes. So again, we can see that great attention to detail, ensuring that each bird is given exactly the kind of environment that it needs. And these photos that I have here are actually from the renovated aviary at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., where they happen to have 2 separate rooms, one with saltwater birds and one with freshwater birds. And it was really quite an amazing parallel when I realized that, some things just work, and why change them, even if it's 500 years later? We're also given a description of how raptors were kept. There were also houses about 9 feet in height and about 6 paces square, one half of which was covered with a roofing of square tiles. The other half, which was open, had a stout lattice of wood. Each of these houses contained a bird of prey, from the kestrel to the eagle, and there were great numbers of each. Across the tops of these houses, there was a perch, and another one out beyond the lattice, so that the birds might use the one at night and when it was raining, and the others to sun themselves and take the air. Now, what's really remarkable to me about this is that it's almost identical to the setup of mews or raptor houses that are in use today. So this image over here is from the John James Audubon Center at Mill Grove, where you might know they have several non-releasable raptors. And you can see that though the materials are a little different, the setup is almost exactly the same. Half covered to provide shelter for the birds, half open so that they can bathe in the rain or take the sun, and then of course perches all throughout the various parts of the enclosure so that the bird can choose where it wants to be at any given time. So again, yet another example of sort of this amazing parallel evolution in terms of bird care techniques, because if something works, it's gonna work, and why change it? Now, with further regard to keeping raptors, this is a very interesting story to me. And there was an offering pit excavated from the foot of the Great Pyramid in Tenochtitlán, which was the main temple. And there were two golden eagles in that pit, a male and a female. And the male's bones show a deformity in his wings that would have rendered him completely flightless. So you can see here how these bones are overlapping. That's not normal. That's the deformity there. Over here, this is a normal wing, his other wing. And you can see how there's a lot more space between those bones. So, of course, a bird that can't fly is going to be completely incapable of surviving in the wild. However, so I should say that since he's incapable of surviving in the wild, we know without a doubt that he was being kept in captivity in these aviaries. However, his bones were measured and determined to be robust and of normal proportions, which shows that he was cared for very carefully and given basically the best quality of life that he could in captivity. And then just to kind of finish out this idea of very, very careful bird care, we have a further passage from Cortez, which reads, "To each kind of bird they gave the food which suited its habits in its free state, so that to those which ate fish they gave it, and likewise worms, maize, and smaller seeds were supplied as required by the different birds. I assure your highness that all those birds which ate only fish received each day 250 pounds. 300 men had the charge of these birds for their sole employment. There were others who were occupied only in curing the birds which were ailing." So again, just really driving home the point that these birds and their care was not something that was taken lightly, but there was a great level of attention placed on ensuring that they got the food that they would naturally eat in the wild, and that captivity was as healthy an environment as possible for them. We can see that there were many people who were employed in caring for these birds, and that was their only job. There was a huge degree of specialization here. And then that was, of course, in addition to these veterinarians who were on call to help with sick birds. So now I hope I have convinced you of the incredible accuracy of observation and categorization of the natural world that the Aztecs had. However, if you're still not convinced, I have one last slide that might just change your mind. So a different volume, volume 10, covers the people. And one of these chapters is dedicated to magicians, which includes the soothsayer and the shapeshifter, and naturally, the attorney. So I think now we can see that the categorization is definitely on point, whether we're talking about birds or various professions of people. So that concludes my lecture. Thank you all so much for coming out and listening to me. A huge thank you to Naveen for inviting me to speak, and just a huge thank you to the DVOC in general for supporting my love of birds ever since I joined when I was 12 years old. And now I am very excited to hear what questions you have.
That was amazing talk.
Thank you.
Excellent, very informative. We'll take questions from the room, and if people on Zoom have any questions, you can either raise your hands or put them in the chat, and I'll read them out. foot.
Victoria,
Yeah.
the Florentine Codex, is that available online? Is there a translation online? Is the original online? What is the status of it
Yes.
for general access?
Fantastic question. For the people of Zoom, is the Florentine Codex available online? What is sort of the way for us common folk to get access to it? Yes, it is available online. I believe there was actually just recently a project that was finished that does have the entire contents of the Florentine Codex online. The Library of Congress also has scans of the full work, but that is strictly the original book. The Spanish is quite readable. It's barely changed. So, that's definitely something that you can look at if you can read Spanish. I also have my trusty copy here. This I got on Amazon. It's a little pricey, but it's worth it. Contains, all the species accounts for birds and of course all the other species. And then it does also include the images, although they are small, not printed at full size.
Is that English?
This is in English, yes. So this is a translation that was translated directly from the Nahuatl into English. Yeah. Yeah.
On the great-tailed grackles, now I
Yes.
certainly appreciate the huge difference in habitats.
Mhm.
What is the evidence that, on the one hand, the emperor introduced the birds?
Yeah.
Versus, for some reason, who knows why,
Mhm.
the birds just came to this new habitat.
Sure.
And they liked them, and the emperor took credit for it.
That is certainly possible. I mean, without going back in time, there's no way to really know for sure. I do think that the account of the codex is fairly straightforward, and we should point out that Emperor Awitzot, who is the one who was credited with introducing the grackle, was the ruler who was reigning just before Moctezuma, so just before Cortez arrived. So this was all very recent history, perhaps even living history for some of the older people in the community. So for that reason, I believe it's a bit less likely that the story had kind of changed from its original accuracy. As you say, I mean, we'll probably never really know for sure. But again, to me, the account is pretty convincing, particularly the fact that they have a name called, which translates to divine grackle, that's usually reserved for very special or very rare species. So the fact that it was a bird that actually had to be brought to the area would perhaps help it qualify as a bird worthy of this name.
I know that, well, from my own experience with peregrines,
Mm.
you can try to take them somewhere else. But if they don't want to be there, if they want to be back where they came from.
Oh, no, that's for sure. Yeah. But then, of course, we have invasive species like the starlings that, you take them somewhere and they're like, oh, this is great, which from the account of the grackle, it seems like that's exactly what they did, where
Starlings were brought to similar habitat, just a different location.
that's true. That's true. Yeah, so yeah, it's an excellent point, and there's probably no way to ever truly know for sure, but further research on the topic would definitely be very exciting.
I'm gonna do a couple questions.
Yeah,
and then we
take
get
some Zoom
back here.
questions.
Dita had a question. He says, interesting that you suggest that a bird name was taken from a god name. Couldn't it be the opposite, namely that a god was depicted based on a specific bird, as for Horus in Egypt?
That is a really good point. I'll admit that I actually had not considered it. It certainly could be. Either way, it doesn't really, make a difference in terms of identification because the fact that it's named for that marking is still the same. I would generally assume that religion had sort of a longer history in the culture, and we know that many of the gods that the Aztecs had were also prevalent in other cultures that were in the area since long before the Aztecs arrived. So again, for that reason, I would kind of assume that religion has kind of more of a tenure there than the names for local birds, but that is a fantastic point.
And do one more question on Zoom. Nilesh, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, Tori, firstly, really fascinating talk. I didn't know what to
Thank
expect,
you.
but I find it very fascinating.
Thank you.
One is a quick question for clarification. So the codex was written to encode what the native population already knew. Is that correct? Did I understand that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So we should acknowledge that part of the reason for the codex, in fact, probably the main reason for why this project was initially undertaken, was to be able to understand these strange native peoples so that we would be, or not we, so that the Spaniards would be better able to convert them to Christianity. So my understanding is that that was sort of the initial motive behind this. But as the project went underway, it became more and more, like you said, a way to sort of record the indigenous knowledge before it was all wiped out by, the forced assimilation.
Right. And then the other, if I may, the other point that really stuck out for me was the reference to migration. Right.
Yes,
So if you're, your dating is around, you say this is dated around 1500.
yes.
And, I think on the sort of the more Western view of when we really understood that migration was occurring is close to the end of the 18th century,
Correct.
with the stork thing happening in the early 19th century.
Right, right.
So it amazes me actually that there's so much reference to migration
Yes,
from something that, well, clearly predates 1500 because they were essentially encoding what was already known and believed.
exactly.
So just a comment, not a question, just it fascinates me.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was probably one of the most fascinating parts of this when I was doing the research as well. I love that you also find it as interesting. But yeah, this definitely well predates any sort of European understanding of bird movement. And yeah, as you mentioned, this was compiled in the 1500s, but this was all indigenous knowledge. That was the large purpose of the work. So it's not like this was a new idea that had been brought over by the Spaniards, but rather there was this pretty deep-seated indigenous understanding of migration and the seasonal movement of birds. And also, I should stress, an understanding that if they didn't breed in, the local area, they were still breeding,
Breeding,
which is
exactly.
in contrast to the story of the barnacle goose, which you might know, they breed at very high latitudes. And in Europe for centuries, it was thought that they literally just popped out of barnacles.
Right.
So again, sort of in contrast to that, we do have this understanding that like, oh, this bird never breeds. It disappears in the summer. It must be breeding somewhere else. It's not just spontaneously coming into existence.
Right. No,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll take a question from the room and then go to you, Manny, after that.
Yeah, my question was this, an easy one, I think. What drew you to this topic?
That's a fantastic question. So for those on Zoom, that was what drew me to this topic. So as you probably all know, I've loved birds since basically I was conscious. And the Aztecs, I kind of had an interest in Indigenous Mexican societies, I'd say starting when I was probably like 8 or 9. And when I was reading these various, like nonfiction children's books about Aztec society, I did learn that they had aviaries. But that was sort of as far as the connection between birds and Aztec society really went for me. A couple of years ago, I was taking an intro to anthropology course. And for my final paper, we were given a lot of freedom in what to write about. And for some reason, I decided to choose birds and knowledge of birds in Aztec society. Definitely very niche topic. Research was kind of hard at first, but the more that I started digging into it, the more that I was finding, which eventually led me to like actual primary sources themselves. And so I think that was when I really sort of realized that it was like a field within itself that could be explored. But I should stress that this presentation here is an expansion of that work, but it's not, something that I've done for school or anything. This is just for fun at this point that I'm continuing to explore.
Okay.
Lenny, did you still have a question?
No, it was more of a comment, but I think it was basically a follow off what Nilesh said about the migration, and pretty fascinating because I'm reading Ken Kaufman's new book, and it sort of goes into like sort of how little understanding these ornithologists had at that time about like migration and even molting and stuff. And it's fascinating that these Aztec people had the understanding that early, and kind of makes me think that if Audubon and those guys kind of maybe worked with indigenous peoples
Yeah.
in our country, maybe they would have had better understanding of the birds at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Take notes, folks. Talk to the locals. Always, they know the area best. But yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great point that in many ways, one could argue that the understanding of birds and their life histories was far more advanced in Indigenous Mexican societies than in contemporary European societies. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely always so much to be learned from Indigenous groups, and particularly in this case where they were intentionally keeping the birds and raising them in aviaries. They had these very, very close relationships with the birds, could see them throughout their entire life cycle, which made for a very intimate understanding of bird behavior and anatomy and just their general life histories. So yeah, fantastic point, absolutely.
One comment and one question. I thought it was incredible too that they mentioned women.
Yes,
Part
that's
of
true.
The workforce for the aviaries. I think that broke a little stereotype that I had of only the men being to do that. that work. My question for you has to do with the mist nest.
Yes.
What evidence is there that what we're using right now is from Japan, as opposed to an idea that was spread from and throughout the Americas?
Yeah, so the comment was just how fascinating it was that women were explicitly mentioned as being the ones to take care of birds, which I definitely agree with. There is a fair bit of evidence that Aztec society was far from perfectly egalitarian, but definitely allowed women to be educated and to have a lot of jobs that we might associate as being strictly male. And the question was, what evidence do we have that the mist nets were in fact taken from Japanese society rather than from the Aztec idea of mist nets? I'll be perfectly honest, my source is Wikipedia. That was just sort of, a side note, because when I realized that, similarities, like, well, where did mist nets come from? So that's kind of like the current dogma, I guess, of where mist nets came from. I wasn't really able to find anything that conflicted that. But yeah, that's a great question. Definitely something that also would warrant further research.
Why are you trying to trip your own daughter up?
That's my job.
Come on, what are you doing? How do we know it wasn't a planet?
Buddy, I'm going to do one on Zoom.
Okay.
Sorry. Zara Khan says, I have a question for Victoria. How would you say that your understanding of bird knowledge and care in Mesoamerica adds to your birding experiences in Philadelphia today? Also, congratulations, you are amazing in all caps.
Thank you. Hi, Zara. For those of you who don't know her, which is probably everyone, she's one of the fantastic new members of my Penn Birding Club. We also have Jonah in the room here today, who is another fantastic member of my new birding club. So thank you so much to both of you for coming out to support me. It means a lot to me. Yes, that's a fantastic question of how research in this field has affected my bird knowledge and experience of birding in the field today. And it has actually affected it a fair bit. I mean, one very simple thing is sometimes it's kind of fun to just sort of note the indigenous Nahuatl names of the birds to myself as I see them. Osprey is Itzcuautli, literally water eagle. Northern pintail is Zimitzcan. So again, even though this is in Mexico, there are a lot of familiar species, and we have the names for a lot of them, which I think is pretty cool. I think it's also just kind of it's really quite awe-inspiring experience to realize how much is so similar. How, for example, the northern shoveler is named for the exact same characteristic, how cliff swallows still nest on buildings, how bird husbandry in many regards is very, very similar. It sort of feels like I'm taking part in this like global legacy of noticing nature and caring for nature in a way that has remained remarkably constant across the span of time and space.
So you referred to the native names. What language is the codex itself written in?
Great question. So the question is, what language is the codex itself written in? So it is written in the indigenous language Nahuatl. Now, Nahuatl did not really have a written form. There was some like pictographic writing, but when the Spanish came and established missionary schools, they also created a Latin alphabet way to record the indigenous language. And so that is basically what the codex is written in, that Latinate transcription of indigenous Nahuatl. And so again, these were the students who went out into the community, spoke with their informants in their native language, and then were recording what they were saying. There is also parallel text in Spanish, but it is parallel text and not a translation. For example, in Nahuatl, we get this, for example, nice species account of a great horned owl or tecoloch. And the Spanish text kind of just says, yeah, there are owls here, like there are owls in Spain. So yeah, it is bilingual in that sense, but the text is not the same.
Do you see, is it odd, or is there like a conflict that they use the native language to record this, and then they basically record all the stuff that they could go out and basically destroy native culture language?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely definitely at odds there. You see a lot of that happening through history, like, oh, let's understand these people so we can better dominate them. There is some evidence to support, and I don't want to overly heroify Bernardino de Sahagún, who was the Spanish monk who was leading this, not at all. He was part of the erasure of culture because he was in a missionary school where that is basically the purpose. However, there is some evidence to suggest that, especially the further he got in his work, the more he actually realized the value of this information. And in fact, Spain actually at a certain point deemed it heretical and ordered that he stop. And he did not stop. Several copies of his work were actually destroyed, but thankfully at least one copy of all the volumes still survives.
Another separate question, sorry, is just with regard to the migration.
Yeah.
Being a kind of a cultural center, is there any evidence that they had long-range contacts, that they would know where these birds migrated to from?
There's absolutely evidence for long-range contacts. I don't know for a fact whether like distribution of birds, like that level of detail might have been known, but yes, the Aztec Empire is very well known for having long distance contacts. We know that they kept scarlet macaws, which are not really a local species to that area. And in fact, in, I believe, like prehistoric times, there is actually archaeological evidence for the keeping of scarlet macaws in Arizona. So again, that was prehistoric times. So even from that long ago, people were traveling and trading enough that live scarlet macaws made it all the way up to Arizona. We know that a lot of the feathers from these various tropical birds were traded very long distances. And there was an entire class of traders called the Purepecha, and their job was basically to go these long distance and acquire goods that couldn't be acquired locally. So definitely evidence for long distance trade and travel. I haven't heard any specific references to, you know, that being like a point of reference for migration, but it does seem rather logical. Yeah.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So I was wondering about descriptions you gave about freshwater pools,
Yes.
saltwater pools, the skilled staff, you take care of many different species of birds. I was wondering if these were property of the monarch in the Aztecs, or if this was kind of like an institution similar to like a modern day zoo.
That's a fantastic question. My understanding is that at least in this particular case, they were the emperor's property himself. The aviary was actually incorporated into the palace, and it was just sort of a way for him to show his wealth, basically, as emperors like to do.
Right. There's a question on Zoom. Kathy Tang asks, if someone gives you a travel budget, where would you go to follow up on this project?
Oh, that's a really good question. If I'm given a travel budget and also a demolition budget, I would go to Mexico City and excavate the aviary, which I'm sure there's a building on top of it right now because, you know, as I mentioned, Tenochtitlán was directly constructed on top of when the Spaniards built Mexico City. So I'm sure that there is a building on top of where the aviary would have been. But let's see. In this slide, this is actually a small detail from a map of Tenochtitlan from the time of Spanish arrival. So we actually have the location for the aviary. So that would definitely be very fun to do. Another thing that I would also love to do would be go to communities that speak Nahuatl, because it is a very active language. I believe there's about 1 million speakers in Mexico alone. And just kind of sit down and go over these species accounts with them. A few of the passages, I didn't really highlight them here because they're a little bit difficult to understand, but a lot of them have translations that don't necessarily make sense. A big case of that is in color. A lot of birds, like for example, the whippoorwill, are described as being dark yellow. I think we all know that whippoorwills are not yellow. Overall, it seems like dark yellow seems to roughly correspond to brown, which, you know, we can imagine that. So I'm not sure if that's, you know, a case of the language not having a word for brown, or if it's sort of a translation error or what, but I would definitely like to sort of parse these translations a little more for sure. Great question.
Any more here? Any questions here? Yes.
This is more a comment. One thing that strikes me here is that the writer of the codex was taking these indigenous people's history,
That's true.
which is quite different from what is commonly done, where the,
For sure.
you know, all powerful, all knowing
Yes,
conquerors
for sure.
then encounter these stupid savages and, oh, they don't know anything.
Right.
We know everything. They actually took them seriously, but simultaneously they were burning, destroying all of the older records because they were the works of the.
Yes.
And that's just
Yeah.
a huge contrast.
Yeah, no, for
A
sure.
surprise and a contrast.
Yeah, yeah. Whenever you have colonialism, there's always these deep contrasts that seem to come up. It does kind of seem like Sahagún was a bit of sort of a rebel himself, because even his work was deemed heretical. But yeah, it's a really good point, and there's definitely parts of it that don't necessarily make sense.
Nilesh, I saw you had your hand up. I don't see it anymore. Are we
No, it's
good?
actually it's actually quite frightening that Art actually said exactly what I was going to say. I don't know what that means, but I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Means you're sick.
But it's in the context of a book I'm reading right now, which I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested. It's called The
Yeah.
Silk Roads. And the Silk Roads, really, that historian, it's a history of the world. And in that historian essentially is connecting events occurring in various parts of the world to each other and showing that, you know, often our histories are very, very siloed in their approach to describing what happened. And in many of those instances, when the first time the indigenous people were encountered, the first thing to do was to wipe out everything that they had done
Yes.
or learned or whatever, right? Because it wasn't taken seriously. So to me, I think at least the monk, if not more people, should get credit for at least trying to write down stuff before destroying it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Whenever we actually do have preserved sources like this, they are definitely incredibly valuable. Yeah, definitely, I would agree that there is definitely due credit for the monk for deciding to take this on, his indigenous scholars for working with him on this. And it was a lot of work. I mean, as I mentioned, this took like the better half of a century to complete all of the volumes of the codex. So yeah, definitely something that yeah, he seems to have cared enough about to really put a lot of his life into it.
Any last questions?
Naveen,
Yes.
this is Greg.
Uh-huh.
Hi, Greg.
Question. I just fabulous talk, Tori, and I'm looking out my window here in Arizona, watching for scarlet macaws. So I'll let you know.
Yes.
Two things. Apparently, the person who brought the mist nets from Japan was Oliver Austin, who was an ornithologist who was in the Navy in Japan. And
oh, yeah, that sounds vaguely familiar now. Yes.
yeah,
Cool.
somehow got onto the use of these very fine nets by Japanese bird trappers who'd been doing that for hundreds of years, apparently. But he's credited with bringing that to the West.
Cool.
Anyway, I'm also reminded of, and I'm trying, do you recall, Tori, hearing Rob Fergus?
Yes, I do. That was a fantastic presentation.
Yeah, the Mayan. And for those who don't know, this was what, Tori, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, before COVID, I think. Talking about his visits to Mayan villages in the Yucatan and interviewing villagers, descendants of Mayans, obviously, about their knowledge of birds and the names of the birds and so forth. And so it just got me thinking, gosh, why aren't there villages with Aztecs, descendants of the Aztecs?
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, wow, were they all wiped out? Anyway, but just your point about how local knowledge, that there may still be a way of accessing that kind of knowledge, even generations later.
Yeah.
So anyway, just superb work and just so stimulating, obviously, by all the questions and, really, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for clearing up about where the mist nets came from and getting me off the hook there.
Of course.
but yeah, I definitely think that sort of like in the field work with the descendant population would be extremely valuable. So as I mentioned, Aztec is not so much a demographic or ethnicity as a political alliance. So
right.
There is no such thing, of course, as the Aztec Empire anymore because the politics fell apart. But there are certainly many speakers of Nahuatl, which is the language that the Codex is written in. There's even a few in the United States. So yeah, I definitely think it would be very interesting to actually sit down with some of these people and just sort of like decode it together and yeah, like work on a new translation. I think that's definitely something needed. The translation that I believe is the only direct Nahuatl to English translation in existence was done in the 1970s. So it's a little old. Some of the ideas are a little old. So definitely something that would be interesting to continue to do. And yeah, just indigenous knowledge of birds is definitely, and all nature is definitely something that is very much worth looking into. Some of you might have heard about the firehawks in Australia, the various
Yes.
species of raptors that intentionally start fires. And yeah, the indigenous people there were like, yeah, we've known about that for like literally thousands of years. Why are you excited? I mean, that's cool. We all deserve to be excited, but yeah, there's definitely so much knowledge there that usually just gets overlooked.
Yeah, you might be interested that researchers at LSU, ornithologists at LSU, and we heard some years ago from women who went on that expedition, that all-women expedition from LSU.
Oh, cool.
But one of the things that they have done over the last, I think beginning in the early 60s, at least with John O'Neill, was to always to interview locals,
Yeah.
about the birds
Yeah.
in the area. And something John O'Neill did, something Ted Parker did, others as well. But, so even today, obviously, to glean knowledge about possibly even undiscovered birds still out there.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yep.
And I'm glad you mentioned that about undiscovered birds, because I believe there are accounts of a couple of extinct birds in the codex, which is pretty cool. There's the slender-billed grackle, and another account of a woodpecker that seems a little ambiguous, but as Eugene Hun, who is someone who has spent a lot of time trying to identify the birds, as he posits, it seems like the imperial woodpecker is the most likely candidate for that species.
wow.
Yeah. So there's definitely some really interesting stuff in there.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great.
That was.
Thank you.